How does a woman convicted of multiple brutal homicides keep walking out of prison and back onto the streets? In 1861, New Orleans was terrorized by a 25-year-old repeat killer nicknamed Bricktop, a woman so volatile she once stabbed a man purely to settle a scientific bet. The courts tried to contain her with short jail sentences, but the system didn't break her. It compromised itself. While behind bars, she met a guard who abandoned his duty to become her criminal partner, creating a lethal alliance that would end in a bizarre act of violence. Watch till the end in the next 8 minutes to understand how a fractured justice system can accidentally incubate the very monsters it is supposed to destroy. Subscribe, because these historical case files only get darker from here. The underworld of the French Quarter. To understand how a 25-year-old woman became the most feared entity in a city teeming with hardened criminals, you have to look at the unique pathology of mid-19th century New Orleans. The city was a booming, chaotic port, flooded with immense maritime wealth, transient sailors, gamblers, and outcasts from across the globe. Traditional law enforcement was severely outmatched, keeping a fragile, superficial grip on the city's cobblestone streets. Entire blocks of the vice districts operated under their own rules, where local brothels functioned less like businesses and more like lawless underground fiefdoms. It was into this volatile, predatory environment that Mary Jackson was introduced at the tender age of 13. Stranded in the underbelly of the city, she survived by adopting a level of ferocity that shocked even the most desperate street thugs. She was nicknamed Bricktop for her shock of vibrant red hair, a visual warning sign across the French Quarter that trouble was walking down the alley. By 1861, contemporary journalists and police blotters openly labeled her the absolute worst woman in New Orleans. She was an explosive, unpredictable force. Brothels, environments where violence and vice were completely normalized, routinely evicted Bricktop. They did not throw her out for her profession. They threw her out because she terrorized the other workers, holding entire establishments in a state of constant, paralyzing fear. The scientific predator. What made Bricktop truly terrifying was not just her physical strength, but her complete, psychopathic lack of human empathy. Her violence wasn't reactive. It was chillingly detached. In 1856, a man in a local tavern made the fatal mistake of insulting her character, calling her a whore. Bricktop did not argue. She picked up a heavy club and systematically beat him to death in broad daylight, showing the community that a verbal slight carried a mandatory death sentence in her world. But it was her second homicide, occurring just 1 year later, that truly revealed the dark, calculating nature of her mind. Bricktop found herself in a heated dispute with a man over a bizarre, macabre question. If a human being is stabbed directly from the front, which way will their body fall? The man argued one direction, Bricktop argued the other. To resolve the scientific disagreement, Bricktop pulled a knife and drove it deep into the man's tall frame. As the life drained from him, she watched his body collapse to the floor, completely unmoved by the human tragedy unfolding at her feet. She noted with cold satisfaction that her hypothesis was correct. He fell forward. 2 years later, in 1859, she and 2 other women knifed a third man simply because he objected to the foul language they were screaming in public. She viewed human life as completely disposable, a minor variable to be cast aside whenever her temper or her curiosity demanded it. The failure of short-term containment. In any modern justice system, a triple homicide suspect who openly killed people over verbal insults and scientific bets would be isolated from the public permanently, either through a lifetime of maximum security confinement or capital punishment. But the 1850s and 1860s legal framework in urban ports like New Orleans was highly fragmented. The courts lacked the bureaucratic infrastructure for long-term psychological evaluation or permanent maximum security segregation for non-capital street crimes. Instead, the local magistrates relied heavily on short-term jail sentences. They used the prison system as a temporary rug under which they could sweep the city's human debris. When Bricktop committed an assault or a localized knifing, the court handed down a sentence of just a few months, treating her homicidal tendencies like a routine public nuisance. The legal philosophy of the era assumed that a short, sharp stint in a dismal cell would act as a sufficient deterrent. In reality, this revolving door policy was a massive systemic failure. Every time the iron gates opened to release Bricktop back into the vice districts, the law was essentially dropping a loaded weapon back into a crowd of unsuspecting citizens. The court's failure to properly measure the threat she posed meant that a major catastrophe was no longer a question of if, but when. The guard who swapped sides. This systemic failure reached its tipping point during one of Bricktop's brief sentences in the late 1850s. While confined within the city jail, she crossed paths with a man named John Miller. Miller was not a criminal, at least not yet. He was a temporary jailer hired by the local authorities to guard the inmates, enforce prison discipline, and maintain the thin line between civilization and chaos. But Miller carried his own dark history in a distinct, intimidating physical trait. He had lost one of his arms in a previous conflict, and in place of his missing limb, he wore a custom-made, terrifying prosthetic. A heavy, solid iron ball and chain was permanently attached and welded directly to his arm stump. Inside the prison walls, this prosthetic was a brutal weapon of institutional control. A single swing from Miller's iron stump could crush a prisoner's skull or break their ribs, making him a highly effective enforcer for the state. But the boundary between the guards and the guarded in 19th century prisons was notoriously porous. Instead of using his position and his terrifying weapon to maintain order, Miller looked at the notorious Bricktop and saw a business opportunity. The prison, an institution explicitly built to isolate dangerous predators from the public, instead functioned as an elite criminal networking hub. The man paid by tax dollars to enforce the law decided to compromise his oath, abandon his post, and form an illicit partnership with the most feared woman in the city, the buttock and twang trap. The moment John Miller's temporary contract with a New Orleans jail expired, he stepped out of his guard uniform and plunged directly into the criminal underworld. He and Bricktop formulated a coordinated, highly profitable street mugging enterprise. To execute their plan, they revived a classic, centuries-old deceptive street hustle known in British criminal slang as buttock and twang. It was a trap explicitly designed to exploit the weaknesses of the transient men visiting the New Orleans vice districts. The mechanics of the crime required perfect synchronization between the two partners. Bricktop, utilizing her position within the local brothels, would act as the primary bait. She would scout the taverns and streets for wealthy targets or punters, enticing them with the promise of a secluded encounter. She would lead these unsuspecting men down into the pitch-black, unpoliced alleys and blind corners of the French Quarter. The moment the victim was isolated, vulnerable, and completely distracted, John Miller would step out from the darkness. Before the victim could even process the threat, Miller would swing his prosthetic iron ball and chain with immense, bone-shattering force. With the target instantly incapacitated or knocked unconscious by the blunt force trauma, the duo would strip the victim of their gold, watches, and cash, vanishing back into the shadows before the local night watch could even be alerted. The final confrontation in the dark. For months, the buttock and twang partnership allowed Bricktop and Miller to prey upon the city with absolute impunity. But their criminal enterprise contained an inherent, fatal flaw. It relied on mutual trust between two inherently untrustworthy, psychopathic individuals. John Miller made the classic, arrogant mistake of assuming that because he was a man, a former authority figure, and armed with a terrifying iron prosthetic, he was the dominant partner in the relationship. He believed he could control and discipline the city's most volatile killer. The breaking point arrived in 1861. Fed up with what he perceived as insubordination, Miller procured a heavy whip and cornered Bricktop in a private room, intending to give her a brutal thrashing to remind her of his authority. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Miller treated Bricktop like a standard victim, completely forgetting that she was a woman who killed men for simple amusement. The moment the whip cracked, Bricktop snapped. Instead of cowering, she lunged directly into the strike, completely overpowering the former jailer. She grabbed the heavy iron ball and chain attached to his own arm stump and used his prosthetic to drag him violently across the floor. In a state of sheer panic, realizing he was fighting for his life against a monster, Miller pulled a concealed knife with his remaining hand. Bricktop didn't hesitate. She sunk her teeth deep into his flesh until he dropped the blade, seized the weapon, and plunged it into his chest. The cost of a compromised system. When the New Orleans authorities finally breached the room, they found a gruesome scene that perfectly symbolized the complete collapse of institutional order. John Miller lay dead on the floor, his life taken by the very knife he had drawn, his body still shackled to the heavy iron ball and chain that had once represented the disciplinary power of the state. The newspaper headlines screamed the news to a fascinated public, noting with dark irony that Bricktop had ignored his weapon entirely to execute her final judgment. The legal system was forced to intervene, dragging Mary Bricktop Jackson back to the courtroom, where she was sent to prison for murder, as the archives record. Again, but the true tragedy of the case wasn't the death of a corrupt former guard. It was the damning indictment of the justice system itself. The courts had possessed multiple opportunities to permanently isolate Bricktop, yet their reliance on a revolving door of short-term sentences allowed her to continuously return to the streets. The system's weakness didn't just fail to protect the public. It created an environment where an officer of the law could be corrupted, weaponized, and ultimately destroyed by the very predator he was hired to restrain. Comment below. Do you think John Miller was purely the architect of his own destruction, or did the failing justice system create the environment that sealed his fate? If you want to continue uncovering the hidden legal mechanisms and systemic failures behind history's most bizarre crimes, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. The vault is full of stories just like this, and our next case file opens very soon.